Hello, my name is Otaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. This is the 13th of a series of short videos dealing with subjects covered in my recent book, Climbing a High Ladder: Development in the Global Economy. Today, we try to illustrate the conceptual framework of natural wealth that we approached in the previous video, with case drawn from Sub-Saharan Africa. With at least 250 million inhabitants in resource-rich African countries, natural assets are responsible for more than 80% of exports and 50% of government revenues. As such, the high concentration of resource-rich countries in the area allows for direct comparisons with their resource-poor, counterfactual regional neighbors. We will then see two contrasting pictures, one associated with the commodity supercycle while it lasted, and the other at the ongoing pandemic, which came after a period in which the downturn of commodity price had brought harsh consequences to especially some oil-rich countries in the region. Let's start by looking at the growth rates of GDP per capita in the region. Now, in this period covered in this chart, and particularly looking at 2000 to 2014, the phase in which the boom of commodities prevailed, resource-rich Sub-Saharan African countries exhibited the highest rates of economic growth. Growth was boosted by new natural asset discoveries and accompanying expectations for commodity price booms. Resource-rich Sub-Saharan African countries demonstrated higher growth rates compared to their resource-poor neighbors since 2000, and even 0.25% more than their resource-rich counterparts elsewhere, as you can see in the chart. This was particularly spearheaded by Angola and Nigeria. Albeit, as you can see, during the commodity bust of 2015-2016, which is when the oil price really come to the floor, this lagged somehow. Now, let's look at the performance in terms of poverty reduction. Resource-rich countries, in fact, led in terms of access to education and years of schooling. And life expectancy has been significantly increased as well. On the other hand, resource-rich Sub-Saharan African countries have not been as successful in inducing rapid poverty reduction rates. Poverty in resource-abundant countries fell only by 9% compared to a 15% decline experienced in the resource-poor ones in the 2000s. Let's also look at the composition and increase of wealth by asset types, comparing the region with other ones. Look at this. The chart shows how challenging increasing the pace of growth remained, right? National wealth in resource-abundant Sub-Saharan African countries is comparable to South Asia region, but behind other developing regions. Note that human capital in Sub-Saharan Africa is just 25% of its Middle East and North African equivalent. Although education spending in Sub-Saharan Africa surpasses 4% of GDP, average years of schooling, learning outcomes, and health spending to GDP ratios were still low in resource-rich Sub-Saharan African countries as compared to the resource-poor, with predictably detrimental effects on the development of labor skills. Total factor productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa, although accounting for half of economic growth rates in the early 2000s due to improved resource exploration and extraction methods, later became more modest in resource-rich Sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, the Sub-Saharan Africa physical infrastructure is the lowest in the developing world. Despite being regarded as having mostly undiscovered resource abundance, with, as I said, resource-rich countries in the region accounting for 70% of the subcontinent's GDP and produced capital, 60% of its natural capital, and approximately 40% of its population, contemporary subsoil discoveries in the period were moderate. At the same time, agricultural yields fared even shorter of expectations than global average, with an ensuing decline of 10% in value added. This result is particularly disturbing, especially considering that with 200 million hectares, Sub-Saharan Africa is endowed with nearly half of the world's uncultivated land that has yet to be put into production. Consequently, as you can see in the chart, the aggregate value of Sub-Saharan Africa's resource wealth has remained unchanged for more than 2 decades, with per capita natural income levels just over those of South Asia, but nevertheless still behind other developing regions' equivalents. We also highlighted in the video on natural wealth the relevance, the key role played by governance. Let's give a look at some of the comparisons provided by multilateral institutions. In this case, I'm using the World Governance Indicators of the World Bank. So look, the institutional picture is not so endearing in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa. In resource-rich Sub-Saharan African countries, the quality of institutions is lower than that of their counterparts in other regions, and even resource-poor neighbors in the same region, especially on terms of property rights and rules-based governance. With low additional levels of productive wealth, low institutional quality obstructs the delivery of public service, as well as the development of an investment and business climate conducive of natural wealth growth. Looking at the chart, according to the World Bank Governance Indicators, resource-abundant Sub-Saharan African countries face serious problems in all institutional dimensions, especially on the most prominent growth areas: government effectiveness, rule of law, and regulatory quality. These institutional restrictions must be dealt with to increase the value of natural endowments through the discovery and development of additional resource. The challenge for political leaders and economic policymakers is evidently to follow policies leading to substantial asset building on 2 levels: a national level, boosting human production and institutional capital, and at a cross-border level, advancing regional commercial integration. If the low availability of these fundamental national wealth, tangible and intangible components is not addressed, Sub-Saharan Africa's current capital and institutional endowments will be inadequate to achieve a sustainable growth rate necessary for more significant socioeconomic development. A major challenge remains to establish a good management of natural resource rents through counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Reliance on commodity rents has been linked to a worsening of fiscal balance. Despite flexible fiscal stimuli introduced during the 2008-2009 crisis and at the end of the 2014 commodity boom, fiscal policy remained pro-cyclical, subjecting the subcontinent economy to commodity price volatility, over borrowing, and uncontrolled government spending, particularly experienced in the cases of Angola and Nigeria. So sound macroeconomic stabilization policies and counter-cyclical fiscal policies are of extreme importance for the reasons that we saw in the previous video. This is to ensure robust and efficient government spending by offering a fiscal buffer during commodity price busts. Several large resource-rich middle-income Sub-Saharan African countries have introduced natural resource or sovereign wealth funds for macroeconomic stabilization policies and counter-cyclical fiscal policies. I'm referring to Angola, Botswana, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Nigeria, along with complementary fiscal rules and savings. Although promising, the results have so far been disappointing. In Angola, the lack of guidelines between fiscal rules and limits to government withdrawal reduced the fund efficiency, whereas institutional arrangements in Nigeria did not prevent pro-cyclical fiscal policy during the boom. Let's give a look at the factors contributing to productivity increase between the two groups of countries, which are presented in this chart. Look, the contribution of labor in resource-rich countries is considerably lower as compared to the resource-poor ones, as you can see in the chart. As we have approached before in the series, total factor productivity reflects human capital and other intangible assets. And it expanded also considerably slower in resource-rich countries than in resource-poor neighbors in the period. Now, looking at the factors behind productivity, the improvement of infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector, would enable farmers to increase the productivity of the agricultural sector. Domestic production capability building would also result from the combination of a business and investment climate that foster innovation and enhance domestic revenue mobilization, including to attract foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment levels in Africa, reaching only 2% of global flows in the second half of the last decade, would eventually increase substantially and sustainably, promoting economic growth. On the cross-border level, as I noticed, regional commercial integration is a missing element for obtaining the intangible institutional capital needed to be strengthened for sub-Saharan African countries to overcome low economic density, thick borders, and long distance to world and regional markets. Despite access to international markets through commodity trade and plentiful integration agreements in place, resource-rich sub-Saharan African economies do not foment bidirectional economic spillovers to and from neighbor countries. There is now hope that the African Continental Free Trade Area, CFTA, may deepen regional integration. The 55 member states of the African Union are establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area to create a single continent-wide market for goods and service and to promote the movement of capital and natural persons. Now, let us leap forward to current times, to the pandemic. The pandemic crisis will be the subject of a future reviewed in this series. But what I want to highlight here in the following is how the picture of resource-rich and resource-poor sub-Saharan African countries has changed relative to the 2000-2014 period that we approached so far. And I'm using here the forecasts presented by the IMF in its World Economic Outlook of April of this year, right? And well, the contraction of minus 1.9% in 2020 remains the worst performance on the record for the region. But the problem is that Sub-Saharan Africa will be the world's slowest growing region in 2021 and risks falling further behind as the global economy rebounds. On current forecasts by the IMF, per capita GDP in many countries is not expected to reach pre-crisis levels until the end of 2025. Limited access to vaccines and the region's lack of fiscal space are expected to weigh on the outlook. As a result, the gap between Sub-Saharan Africa's growth and the rest of the world is expected to widen further over the next 5 years, as depicted in the chart. The region is projected to grow by 3.4% by the IMF, buoyed by the global recovery, increased trade, higher commodity prices, and the resumption of capital inflows. However, The recovery in Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to lag behind the rest of the world, with a cumulative per capita GDP growth over 2020 to 25 projected at 3.6%, substantially lower than in the rest of the world, which is expected to grow by 14%. And there is a divergence of growth paths within the region, according to the IMF forecasts, which, of course, this reflects the bad debt legacies from the previous period of up and down phases of the commodity super cycle on the resource, on most resource-rich countries, particularly in the case of the oil exporters, which are some of the more populous countries in the region, and which are not expected to have gains in per capita income over the period depicted in the chart. Non-resource dependent countries are forecast by the IMF to see average per capita incomes rise by 21.6% by 2025, whereas oil exporters are not expected to exhibit gains in per capita income over this period. It's really a picture quite different from the one that we saw during the boom phase of the super commodity cycles. Now, the path towards poverty eradication and improvement of living standards should be paved with improvements in levels and use of natural wealth, which is to be obtained by increased accumulation of non-resource types of capital. And that applies for both resource poor and especially resource rich Sub-Saharan African countries. You need to have, as we discussed in the previous video, the natural wealth being accompanied by its transformation into other kinds of assets, intangible assets, besides produced goods. But we need to have this increase of intangible wealth, which is something directly associated to the institutional development, including governance traits that we discussed. You will find a discussion on natural wealth and growth in Sub-Saharan African countries in chapter 15 of my book that you can find on those places on the slide. In the next video, we will return to the topic of the middle income trap. In fact, I will compare two opposite experiences in that regard, South Korea and Brazil. Stay tuned.